Generals, military officials, government officials, they care more about power and money than human life. Human life is the last thing on their minds. Even though it is human life that they need to do wars, it is human life that they need to gain power, it is human life that they need to maintain power, it is human life that they need to maintain an economy, it is human life that they need to maintain commercial ties with other countries, yet it is human life that they care the least about. Here lies the tragedy of human existence. And what is lost in all of this nightmare? What is lost in this cacophony of propaganda? Human life. People don't care about human life. People only care about power. And that's that. One thing that you will learn reading history and reading the news is that the last thing that people care about, the last thing that governments care about is atrocities, genocides, massacres, the terrible loss of human life, the ginormous loss of human life. Human beings are seen as a means to an end. Human beings are seen as expendable. Human beings are seen as tools to use to gain a certain goal, to gain a certain end, to gain a victory in a war, to gain money, to gain power. Human beings are seen as mere cannon fodder. And you have people who do not understand the deception of war, the deception of propaganda that is utilized to incentivize people to go to war. People do not realize that people are deceived to join the ranks of armies under the title of nationalism and patriotic pride. And they go off into the battlefields, and they go off into the trenches, and they are slaughtered. And the very enemy that slaughtered them is then seen as an ally later on. As time transpires, the very enemy that slaughtered a nation's soldiers is seen as an ally. And then all of a sudden relations are built. All of a sudden trade relations are built. Commerce is built. Why? Because people need to make money. And we'll talk about those who died in the war. We'll talk about those who died for their country. But the bottom line is the most important thing, and that is profit, money, the military-industrial complex. Human life is the last thing that is cared about. When wars are fought, bloodshed abounds, and they are seas and oceans of gore. Human life is the last thing that governments care about. It is human life that is necessary to do war. It is human life that is necessary to have countries. It is human life that is necessary to have entire economies. All economies are dependent on human life, yet it is human life that is the least cared about. Is that not sad? Is that not the ultimate tragedy of life? That human life is the most necessary thing, yet it is the least cared about. And I was reading a story today, the story of Asa Jennings. He was an American minister. In fact, he had a failed career as a minister, but he went to the Greek city of Smyrna to work as a humanitarian because there was a war between the Turks and the Greeks lost, and the Greeks were trying to control this city called Smyrna, but they lost. They lost in a war fighting with the Turks, and so the Turks said, okay, we have taken the city of Smyrna from the Greeks. We have won the city of Smyrna. The Greeks have lost. The Greeks have been utterly vanquished. Now it is time for us to enjoy the spoils of war. And so the Turks sacked the city, and the Turks were going to burn the entire city and kill everyone inside of it. They didn't care about the civilians. They didn't care about Greek civilian life. They wanted to reap what they believed belonged to them. And so they began the sacking of Smyrna. And there was this American minister, Mr. Asa Jennings, and he managed to get his family onto an American ship. He was an American citizen. His safety was secured. His life was secured. The Turks weren't going to kill him. He didn't have to worry about the Turks killing him or any member of his family. But he felt guilty. Within himself, there was this feeling of pain, this feeling that irked him, this feeling that told him he needed to do something to save human lives. Asa Jennings, at one point in time, had tuberculosis, and there were doctors who told him that you only have weeks to live. They told Mr. Jennings, you are going to die in a matter of weeks, but he did not die. He survived tuberculosis. And so he said, God has allowed me more time to live on this earth, and that means that God has for me a purpose. There is a mission that God wants me to do. What is that mission? And it was in that Greek city of Smyrna, that city that was about to be riddled with flames and destroyed, that he realized, this is my mission. My mission is to save human life. And so he put his family on the ship and he said, hold on, I have to go save people. I have to go save human life. And he stayed in the city of Smyrna and he helped refugees. And he spoke with the leader of the Turks, Kemal Ataturk, and he said, Mr. Ataturk, please spare the refugees, spare the civilians, spare the women and children. Do not do this massacre. Do not make this city into an ocean of blood. And Kemal Ataturk said, you have 7 days to find a way to get these people onto ships. Not all of the people. Only the elderly, that includes elderly men, women, and children. Men of fighting age cannot be rescued because the Turkish soldiers are so angry, they are so enraged at the Greeks that they will not want to spare any Greek men of fighting age. And that age bracket was somewhere from, I think it was from the age of 17 up to 46 or somewhere around there. And so Kemal Ataturk told Mr. Asa Jennings, you have 7 days. 7 days to find the ships to put around 350,000 Greek civilians on to rescue them. And so he accepted the terms laid out by Mr. Ataturk. So he went out looking for a ship. And there was, Smyrna is a city on the Turkish coast, so there were plenty of ships. And the Turks were burning the city. And hundreds of thousands of refugees were all cluttered together in one spot, trying to find any sort of space to survive in. And there were Greek refugees, there were Greek civilians who were leaping into the water because they couldn't no longer stand on the land because of the flames. That's how ferocious the sacking of the city was. And so you had all these civilians, all these refugees in the water helplessly, and many of them drowned. And they were American naval ships looking at this horror, looking at this destruction, the destruction of this city. And the official order from the U.S. government was, do not help any of the civilians. Why? Because the United States must maintain its diplomatic relations with the Turks. So we are not going to save any civilians. That was the official order. That was the official policy. Why is that? Because human life is the least of a government's concerns. Human life is the one thing that governments care the least about. They don't give a damn. What the U.S. government cared more about was maintaining its relations with the Turks. We can't lose our alliance with the Turks. The Turks do control the Dardanelles, and we definitely don't want to lose that. And we definitely don't want to lose our commercial relations with the Turks. And so there was this sea of destruction, this sea of death. There was this whole quagmire of blood and gore. And in the midst of this hell, in the midst of this inferno, there was a glimmer of humanity, a glimmer of humanity. And there were some American sailors who saw these poor people drowning in the water, and they went out to save them. And there were righteous American sailors who went out of their way to save Greek civilians, to save human life. And there you saw this glimmer of humanity in this sea of indifference to human suffering, in this inferno, in this hell on earth, in this utter callousness towards human life. There was humanity. And in fact, there was one American soldier. His name was Lieutenant Commander Halsey Powell, and he pointed his guns at the Turkish army, and he said, "Back off." And why was that? Why did Mr. Powell do that? Because he had humanity in him. But not only that, he wanted to help Mr. Jennings in his mission to make sure that the Turks did not touch the civilians as they were being evacuated. But how were they going to be evacuated without ships? And this was the job of Mr. Jennings. So Mr. Jennings went out looking for a ship that would be willing to take in all these civilians, or to take in thousands of civilians. And he found a French ship, and he went to the French and he said, "Can you please allow for your ship to be used to hold civilians so that they may be transferred over to Greece?" And the French said, "No, we're not going to do that." And there was this callousness towards human life. And so Mr. Jennings went to this Italian ship, and he told the Italians, "Can you please allow for your ship to be used to hold in refugees?" And this Italian man looked at Mr. Jennings and he said, "I will do this for you, but for money. You give me money. You give me bribe." And there was this Italian guy who was willing to take in refugees, but he wanted money. He wanted a bribe. And so Asa Jennings, being this man filled with humanity, having this longing to save these people, and knowing that he would feel utterly guilty if he did not save human lives, he paid the bribe. He said, "Okay, you want your money? Here you go." So the Italian takes the money, and 2,000 people are allowed to board this Italian ship. And then the Italian looks at Mr. Jennings and he says, "I want more money. Give me more money." And Mr. Jennings said, Whoa. We had a deal. I gave you your money. The people are on the ship. Now take them to Greece. I want more money. And how do I know that the Greeks will not accept these refugees?" And Mr. Jennings said, "I will go onto the ship. We will go to Greece. We will go to the Greek port of Mytilene, and I will make sure that these refugees are allowed to disembark from the ship." So he got onto the ship. The ship moved to Greece. They went to Mytilene, and the refugees were allowed to disembark from the ship, no problem. And so he needed more ships because, remember, Kemal Ataturk told Asa Jennings, "You have 7 days to save 350,000 civilians, and you need to get the ships. It's up to you to find the ships to get these people to board on, to save them." So here was Mr. Jennings. He was in Greece, and, well, all these Greek naval ships were around him. And he said, "Okay, there are plenty of ships here." So he went to a Greek general, General Francou, and he told General Francou, "Kemal Ataturk has allowed for the Greeks to rescue their people. Kemal Ataturk has told me that I have 7 days to get the ships to allow refugees to board on, to save them. So now is your chance, Mr. Greek general, Mr. Greek nationalist, to save your people from the barbarous Turks." And General Francou says, "No, I will do no such thing. I will not allow you to take ships to save Greek refugees, Greek civilians. I will not allow it." And Mr. Jennings was shocked. Here is this Greek general who was a proud Greek man, who was a man that hates the Turks. He despises the Turks. And here he has a chance to save his people from bloodshed. Here he has a chance to save his people from the barbarians who are going to burn the entire city of Smyrna. And he has no interest in donating ships to save his people. Mr. Jennings was infuriated, and rightfully so, understandably so. But why didn't General Francou want to save his people? Why didn't General Francou want to donate some naval ships to save hundreds of thousands of Greek civilians? Because Mr. Francou was in the midst of planning a coup to overthrow the Greek government, and he wanted to use the naval ships for his coup. So he cared more about gaining power than saving human life. And here was this Greek general. He's a high-ranking member of the Greek military, proud Greek man filled with patriotism. And here he had an opportunity given to him by God to save human life. And he didn't take that opportunity because he cared more about power. And this is what I'm talking about. Generals, military officials, government officials, they care more about power and money than human life. Human life is the last thing on their minds. Even though it is human life that they need to do wars, it is human life that they need to gain power, it is human life that they need to maintain power, it is human life that they need to maintain an economy, it is human life that they need to maintain commercial ties with other countries, yet it is human life that they care the least about. And this is the dark reality. Here lies the tragedy of human existence. And so General Franco did not give a damn about his own people. He cared more about doing his coup. And so Mr. Jennings was infuriated. And so he went to a Greek battleship. It was called the Kilkis. And there he met a Greek captain by the name of Theophanides. And he said, Mr. Theophanides, I need your help. Would you be willing to donate battleships to save the lives of Greek people who are about to be butchered by your enemy, the Turks? And Captain Theophanides said, I will gladly answer the call. And it was with Greek ships that Mr. Asa Jennings coordinated the evacuation to save all these Greek people. And he literally saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. He got the ships, he met the right people, and he found the little glimmer of humanity in this ocean of indifference to human suffering. And so here you find this little glimmer of humanity. And also in the American Lieutenant Commander Halsey Powell, you find this glimmer of humanity, because while the evacuation was happening, Powell knew of the sanguinary desires of the Turks. Powell knew about the bloodlust of the Turks. And so he wanted to make sure that the evacuation was going to be done. And so as the evacuation was happening, Halsey Powell pointed his guns, his naval guns, at the Turkish army, and he said, back off, to make sure that the evacuation would be done. If you were a soldier who wanted to follow orders, you wanted to follow your government, and the order from the U.S. government was, don't save any of these people because we have to maintain our relations with the Turks. If you wanted to be a good employee for the U.S. government, you would have acquiesced to that demand. You would have listened, and you would have said, no, be smart, guys. Are we going to risk losing our jobs? Are we going to risk looking bad in the eyes of our employers by saving these people's lives? And that's how things usually are. There is this pressure. People will say, be smart. Don't care so much about doing the right thing. Be smart. Save your job. The last thing that governments care about is human life. And you see this, for example, in the battle over the Dardanelles in World War I. You had Winston Churchill, who was really leading that battle behind the scenes. And Winston Churchill was told, if you allow all these British naval ships to rush through the Dardanelles, they are going to be ruined because the Turks have flooded that whole area with underwater mines. Winston Churchill did not give a damn. He said, well, if we have loss of life and if we lose ships, it will be worth it because we will make many, many gains in this war. That's pretty much what he said. And he said it himself. He said that the ships are expendable and therefore human life is expendable. And what happened in the battle over the Dardanelles? What happened in the Gallipoli campaign of World War I? A lot of British naval ships were destroyed. You had German U-boats under the water. They destroyed ships. And so Winston Churchill just said, okay, well, we lost all these ships, so just have those ships rush through the waters and get our soldiers onto land. And that's what happened. And all these soldiers, all these Kiwi, New Zealander soldiers, British soldiers were rushed, Australian soldiers, they were rushed through the water to land. And it was like a whole D-Day operation, and a lot of people were killed. And the Gallipoli campaign ended up being a complete nightmare because all of these poor British soldiers and all of these poor subjects of the British Empire, all of these Kiwi soldiers and Aussie soldiers were completely stranded. They were without naval support. No naval support. So here they were out in the open, and they were utterly susceptible to being shot by sniper fire. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and it was a months-long battle that the British lost. Countless lives were lost. And it's very, very tragic because the British, well, they entered this war fighting the Ottomans, but the whole nightmare could have been prevented. How so, you may ask? Well, in the 1850s, I want to say from 1853 until 1856, there was a war called the Crimean War. The British allied with the Ottomans. They allied with the Ottomans against the Russians. Why? Because the Russians were a hair away from conquering Constantinople. They were a hair away from taking back Constantinople for the Eastern Orthodox world. The Russians were very close to conquering Anatolia. And so the British said, well, we have to help our ally, the Turks. We have to help our Ottoman allies. And so the British, alongside the French, joined the Ottomans, and they declared war on the Russians. And they did a 3-year war. It's called the Crimean War. And they defeated the Russians. And they threw the Russians out of Anatolia. And so what happened in the end? In the end, the British had to face the Ottomans. And how many people died in that war? And how many Armenians were butchered by the Ottomans? And if only the British had not intervened and had not stopped the Russians from defeating the Ottomans and taking, or I should say retaking, Constantinople for the Eastern Orthodox. The British would not have been in that nightmare in Gallipoli. But human life is something that is not cared about. They could have prevented what happened in World War I, but they didn't. They did not, because they cared more about what? Their alliances. They cared more about what? Their partners. Before World War I sparked, the British were making naval ships for the Ottomans. So they helped the Ottomans defeat the Russians. And then before World War I, here were the British making naval ships for the Ottomans. And then they were at war with the Ottomans, and they were in that terrible, terrible Gallipoli campaign in which countless lives were lost. And Winston Churchill didn't give a damn. He said, those naval ships are expendable. Human life is expendable. It's so sad. And think about the preciousness of one human life. How much time went into raising that human being? This human being's mother gave birth to him. The mother and the father took care of this child, raised this child up into adulthood. For decades, they were taking care of their son. And then all of a sudden, their son has to go fight in a war against the Ottomans. Why? Because the British stopped the Russians from defeating and crushing the Ottoman Empire? And now the British were facing the very Ottomans that they once supported in a war? And how many people were killed in the Crimean War? How many countless lives were lost in the Crimean War? Why? To help the Ottomans, who the British would eventually fight anyway. And what is lost in all of this nightmare? What is lost in this cacophony of propaganda? Human life. Human life. Human life that mothers and fathers invested decades of their lives for. Just lost like that. And I remember when I was a teenager in high school, I was seriously thinking about joining the military. And I told my father, I remember we were in the car and we were driving. It was in the evening. We were in the Bay Area. We were somewhere in San Francisco, I believe. And I remember telling my father, I said, Dad, I want to join the military. He said, the hell you're not. I said, what do you mean? He said, son, I didn't raise you for all these years so that you can one day get killed by a 10-cent bullet and for some politician to come to me and shake my hand and say, oh, your son died for his country. I said, that's not why I raised you. That's bullshit. And that has stood with me till today. It never left me, what my father told me that night. And it reminds me of what my father told me about my great grandfather, my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, was forced to join the Ottoman military. And they gave my great-grandfather a sword, they gave him a scimitar, and they tried to force my great-grandfather to fight the British. And do you know what my great-grandfather did? He ran away. Now you could say, oh, dishonorable, cowardly, such cowardice. Your great-grandfather was a coward. He was a coward? No, he wasn't, actually. He was smart. He was smart because more than likely he would not have made it, and I wouldn't be here right now talking to you guys in front of this camera. Because my great-grandfather chose to save his own life, human life continued on and was perpetuated. My great-grandfather cared more about human life than the Ottoman government, than the British government. He saved his own life, and by that, he saved future lives. I'm here right now because my great-grandfather was a deserter. Human life is so precious. Human life is so precious, and yet it's the one thing that governments care the least about. They only see human life as a means to an end. And you see it, the Ottoman Empire butchered 1 million Armenians, and the German government knew about this, and the German government supported it. Why? Well, as the German military official, Mr. Hans von Seeckt, said, we cannot lose our relations with the Ottomans, we cannot lose our alliance with the Ottomans, and therefore we must support the extermination of the Armenians because the Armenians are an ally of the Russians, and if we allow the Armenians to exist, the Russians are going to use the Armenians as a proxy against our Ottoman ally, and they will use the Armenians to further carve out the Ottoman Empire, thus weakening our ally and strengthening our enemy, Russia. And so because of government policy, 1 million people had to be slaughtered. That's how much governments care about human life. Human life is something that they care the least about. They only see human life as a means to an end. And you can see this mentality today. It has never left humanity. In the war of 2020 in Nagorno-Karabakh, in which Turkey and Azerbaijan went to war on the Armenians lost, and over 100,000 Armenians were forced out of their homes. People didn't give a damn. 1 million people have been killed in the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians. People don't give a damn. You have people in NATO saying, keep on fighting, Ukrainian. Keep on fighting. Doesn't matter how many of your people die, we don't give a damn as long as you kill Russians. And you look at what's happening in the West Bank. Ethnic cleansing that very few people are talking about. Tens of thousands of people pushed out of their homes, and the Israelis are laughing about it. The Americans don't give a damn. In fact, you have people in the U.S. government saying, you must call the West Bank Judea and Samaria because Israeli ideology is more important than human life. The Israeli government has kicked out hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, but not only that, the Israeli government has literally destroyed hundreds of businesses owned by Palestinians. And we talk about the George Floyd riots, and we say, look, businesses are being destroyed. And the George Floyd riots were awful. They were disgusting. But here you have in the West Bank hundreds of people's businesses being destroyed by the Israeli government, and no one cares. People don't care about human life. People only care about power. And that's that. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.